Welcome back to Life Enrichment with Hank Ballinger. Today we want to talk about, can a Christian be wealthy or build wealth? Now, over the years I've had several people ask this question, and a fairly standard answer, but I want to go over that because I feel like there probably will be some people out there that will probably have the same question or derivative thereof, and so we want to look at that idea. Is it okay? Because some people say, well, you know, they look at, the lust of money is the root of all evil. Well, we'll look at that, but before we get into that, before we answer this question and get too deep into that, I want to say thank you to the listeners, for those who listen. We do appreciate it. We greatly appreciate. We would appreciate if you would hit the like button and the subscribe button. I know many people don't as they watch videos, but if you could hit the like button, subscribe, and share us on Facebook. We'd really appreciate the gesture. Thank you. Now, can a Christian be wealthy? Now, there are a lot of people that have a lot of very passionate ideas when it comes to anything about the Bible. Now, I'm not going over this topic to be argumentative. I'm going over this topic just to hopefully clear up some ideas, and I want to look at it from a biblical standpoint rather than what Hank says or what my ideas are. I want to look at it and see what God has to say about the topic. So, a lot of people will refer to verses like Matthew 19:24 that says, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter into the kingdom of God. Well, Jesus did say that. Now, in that day and time, the needle's eye, or the eye of the needle, was considered a very low part that a camel, it was hard for him to get into a corral. So what they would do is they would unladen the camel, take everything off, and then he would have to get down really low to go through this, what's called the needle's eye, to get in the corral. And it was very hard for him to get in there. And when Jesus refers to the needle's eye, that a lot of times that's what he's talking about when he says it's easier for a rich, or harder for a rich man to get into heaven than it is the camel to go through the needle's eye. Now, it doesn't say it's impossible, it just says it's hard. And it might be hard for anybody to get into heaven, not just a rich man, but sometimes rich people allow their money and their wealth to get between them and God. And then they find themselves out on the lake more times than going to church on Sunday, or maybe they're playing golf on Sunday instead of going to church, or serving God and giving God his fair share of money, of their time, of their efforts, of their service. So if we do that, obviously then that is wrong. Some people will also use Matthew 19:21. Jesus said to him, if thou wilt be perfect, go and sell all that you have and give it to the poor. Now, that's a tough saying. That's a hard saying. To take everything that you've got, that you've worked for, that you've accumulated, and just give it away, give it to somebody else. That's a hard thing, knowing that, well, I've either got to try to make it back or I've got to stay poor. And that's not a fun lifestyle many times, especially after you've been wealthy. So that's a hard saying for this young man. And we realize in the story he went away sad because he didn't want to give away all that he had. But that's what Jesus told him to do. Now, are these verses, and the one about, it's the lust of money in James, when it says the lust of money is the root of all evil. It's the lust of money, not money itself. If we lust after money more than we serve God and lust after God, then having money is wrong. We're putting it between us and God. But I want to look at several Bible illustrations and Bible references that show that it's not wrong or anti-biblical to serve God and be wealthy. So let's look at some things. In Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 and 2, God told Abraham he would make him a great nation. And as we read the story starting in Genesis 12 and we read on in Abraham's life, we realize Abraham was a very wealthy man, and it's very evident by the text there in Genesis that God allowed him to be, and God even made it possible and blessed him enough to where he would be wealthy. But in the New Testament, it says that it was Abraham's faith. His faith in God is what made him that. Even though he had a great amount of wealth, he didn't allow the wealth to come between him and God. He used his wealth to serve God. That's important. It's not important just to have wealth. It's to have that wealth and use it to serve God. Now, I want to look at Job. Now, if we look at Job, we realize that almost everybody knows the story of Job. He was a great man. He had a lot of livestock. And the greatest man and the richest man in the East, that is what the Bible says in the book of Job chapter 1. He was the richest man in all of the East. I don't know exactly how big of an area that encompassed, but he was a very wealthy man. And it was very evident by the text that God is the one that encouraged him and allowed him to be wealthy. Now, we also know the story of Job, that he was tempted and tried very much. All of his kids died. All of his livestock was either died or was stolen. His wife even turned on him and said, "You just need to curse God and die." His sons and daughters were killed. The tent fell in on them. They died. He lost everything, supposedly. But the thing that was really important, he maintained his relationship to God, and he put that above all that other stuff. Very hard to do, but he was a very faithful guy. Let's look at Job. Let's look at something here. In the first part, in chapter 1 of Job, if you want to look this up in your Bibles, Job chapter 1, he had 7,000 sheep. Now, I don't know about you. I'm not really a farmer. Never have been. Wasn't a farmer growing up. Never been a farmer in my adult life. I don't know what I would do with 7,000 sheep, let alone throw in 3,000 camels on top of that, 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 donkeys. I don't know what I would do with all that livestock. Don't have a clue. But I'm saying I would probably have to hire a lot more help because I wouldn't know what to do with it. But even once I had the help, how would I make money from all that? I don't know. Don't have a clue. I'd have to figure it out pretty quick if it was just thrust upon me. But Job knew, and he was accumulating wealth. Now, obviously, all that was taken away from Job. It was all gone. But in Job chapter 42, let's look at something very interesting. Remember in chapter 1, he had 7,000 sheep. God blessed him, and it's very evident in Job chapter 42, verse 12, it says, "So the Lord blessed the latter end of Job more than the beginning." That's pretty interesting. Let's see how much more he blessed him. He had 7,000 sheep. In chapter 42, he has 14,000. It's doubled. He had 3,000 camels. He now has 6,000 camels. He had 500 yoke of oxen. He now has 1,000 yoke of oxen. He had 500 donkeys. He now has 1,000 donkeys. Now, what's interesting is that it says that Job had, in the beginning, he had 10 kids. And then in the end, when God blessed him, he had 10 kids again. Now, some people may look at that and say, well, look there, God didn't double his kids. Yes, he did. If you look, he doubled everything he had here numerically, but his kids he only doubled. He had 10 in chapter 1 and he had 10 in chapter 42. How's that a doubling? His kids didn't cease to exist like the animals did. His kids, they were taken care of. They were okay. They were still alive. He had 10 other kids, and now collectively he has 10 that have passed away, but they're still alive, just not here on earth. And then he has 10 that are living now. His children were doubled also. Everything he had, and remember, it was the Lord who blessed the latter end more than the former days. Now, if we look at King David, King Solomon, obviously these are very wealthy men. very wealthy. King Solomon is generally considered one of the richest men of all time. Now, that's when you put men like Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, Warren Buffett, Zuckerberg. When you take all of these guys, King Solomon may have put them to shame. It's hard to say exactly what he had and compare that to today, but he was a very wealthy man. Who blessed him? Who made that possible? God, both King David and King Solomon. Very evident that this text in 1 Kings chapter 10, when it talks about Solomon, Queen Sheba, she came from her homeland. Now, in that day and time, if you come from your homeland to visit a king to ask him questions on how you're going to run your kingdom, it's not an easy chore. You have to get a big caravan of people, of wagons, of horses, of camels, of sheep, spices. She brought all kinds of things to him as a gift. And it says in chapter 10, verse 1, that the questions she asked him were hard questions. She's not going to leave her homeland as a queen, come to where he's at, and then say, well, why is the grass green? Why is the sky blue? No, she's going to ask him, how do you correctly govern a people to where they don't revolt? How do you monetarily make a nation boom and monetarily gain year after year after year? And she looked around at his servants and at his household. They were dressed amazingly well, and they were all very wealthy, and they were all very content, and that impressed her. So this is a lady who, great chore just to come from where she was to where he was, and she made the journey, and she brought him many, many gifts. And then she was amazed, and she said, my goodness, people had told me about you for years. I couldn't believe it. She said, even the half has not been told to me about how wise you are. Why was he so wise? God blessed him, gave him the wisdom. So many times gifts is not just in monetary form. He was blessed with wisdom. Now, let's look at something else. This is Old Testament, but look at what the Old Testament says in Proverbs chapter 13, verse 22. Now, I really love this text. It says this, a good man leaveth an inheritance to his children's children. Now, if you watch Dave Ramsey, you'll find that some people call in to him sometimes, and they're 60, 65, 70 years old. They are in debt still. They have no savings. They have no money, no retirement. They have nothing. And they ask Dave, how am I going to get out of this? He says, you can't. You're going to have to work the rest of your life. You're going to have to get another job, and you never see it inside of a restaurant unless you work there. You're going to have to eat beans and rice and beans. And he just says, you're too late. He said, you can't build wealth. It's too late. You're just going to have to work. And that's a tough position to be in. And they have nothing, not only to pass on to their children's children, but even to pass to their children, many times other than debt. They're passing on debt. They have nothing to pass on, let alone to their children's children. And that's what the Bible encourages, to pass on not just something to our kids, but an inheritance for our children's children. That's very important. And that's biblical. So you can't leave an inheritance for your children's children unless you are wealthy. And this is a command. Okay? Really, read the Bible. That's a command. Now, in Mark chapter 10, verses 29 and 30. Now, very interesting text. It says, if you will forsake much, God will give much. Now, you could look at this text in Mark chapter 10, or you could look in Matthew chapter 19, and both of these they're parallel texts. Gospels, the synonymous Gospels, the Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they say the same stories, a lot of the same things, and these synonymous stories, one may say add something here, and the other one may add something else, and collectively they teach a lot. But it's different points of view, and it's interesting that Matthew, Mark, and Luke have different points of view, sometimes about the same story. So when they're talking about this, I think it's Peter that asked, Lord, he said, we have left all and followed you. He said, Callie, what he's saying is, we've left all and followed you. What do we get out of this? What's in it for us? And Jesus says, there isn't anybody who has left home and brothers and sisters and mother and father and followed me that won't be rewarded 100 times over in this life and the life to come. Now, what's he talking about? Is he saying, and he actually says in Mark's account, he says, you will be rewarded with houses and brothers and sisters and mothers and fathers and persecution. That's an interesting one, isn't it? Persecution. But he says, you will have hard times, but if you make it through those hard times, you will be rewarded in this life and the life to come. Much more than anything you give up, you will be rewarded 100 times over. Now, a lot of times we think, well, maybe I'd like to have 100 houses. If I offer up my house, am I going to have 100 houses? Or if I give my family, am I going to have 100 more family members? Not really the context that's given there. It's just saying you cannot outgive God. Ed Bousman always used to say that. You cannot outgive God. No matter what we give in this life, it's just not even a drop in the bucket as to compare to what we can receive. So God is not against us having wealth in this life and later. He gives much. He gives much and encourages us to have much. Now, I want to look at one other text, Matthew chapter 25, verses 14 through 30. Now, everybody knows this story. There was a guy who had wealth, and he was going to go away for a while, and he put some people in charge of his affairs, of his businesses. And one of them, he gave 5 talents, and that was a form of money. And he gave him 5. And he said, now, I'm going to go away, and I'm going to leave you with these 5. And when I come back, I want to see what you've done with them. One of them he gave 5, one of them he gave 2, and the other one he gave 1. Well, he went away for a certain period of time. He came back, and the one that had 5, he called him, and he said, okay, I gave you 5 talents. What did you do with them? He said, well, I've gained 5 others. He said, oh, you're a good servant. He said, you've done well. So he had much, and he was given much more because he was worthy to be able to take it and correctly use it. Then he had the one with 2, and he called him forward. He said, now, I gave you 2 talents. What'd you do with those? He said, I gained 2 other talents. He said, oh, you've done well. You've done well. Here you go. You're doing well. You come right up here. You're going to sit right here beside me. Called the one that had 1. He said, now, what'd you do? He said, I knew you was a tough man. I knew you were tough in business. So he said, I didn't want to mess up and maybe lose that talent. He said, I just went out and hid it. And he said, here it is. I've uncovered it and I brought it to you. You got your 1 talent back. What did he say to him? He said, you are a slothful servant. He said, you didn't do anything with it. You've taken that talent and done nothing. And again, the talent is a form of money, not just specifically a talent that we may be able to do something with as far as our physical abilities. But he said, this that I've entrusted to you. So when we look at all of this idea, what has God entrusted to us in life? Well, first of all, he gives us life itself. He says, what are you doing with your life? Are you wasting your life, or are you using your life for me? And he says, if you use your life for me, I will maybe give you long life. And isn't that what he says in the Old Testament? You know, if you honor your father and mother, make your days long on the earth. And he says, there you go. There's your family. What are you doing with your family? I've given you a family, you know, your mother, father, brothers, sisters. What are you doing with that? Are they better off for you having been their son or their brother or sister? What are you doing with your fellow man? Are you making life easier for them, better for them? If you're not, then you're not using your time wisely. So he said, if you will use the things I have given you, I will give you more to enhance your life, but also to enhance the lives of others and the lives of God, our service to Him. He also says, I will give you money. And if you will use it wisely, I will give you more money. And if you use that wisely, I will give you more. Remember the talents in Matthew 25. So I don't think it's wrong for a person to have wealth, to build wealth, to be wealthy. I just think we need to very seriously realize who gives us that wealth and use that wealth, first of all, to serve God, to serve our family, to serve our fellow man, and then to serve ourselves. You can be wealthy. The Bible, I don't think, teaches that we are to be paupers, that we are to be poor. The Bible teaches and encourages us to be wealthy and to have an inheritance for our children's children. Nowhere, I think many times, Old Testament, New Testament, God blessed people with wealth. So you can be wealthy. You can build wealth. Use it for God, your family, your fellow man, and then yourself. You can be redneck rich. See you on the next video.